Ash Hollow was the kind of town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, it was surrounded by dense forests, their towering trees casting long, eerie shadows over the narrow, winding roads that led into the heart of the town. The population was small, just a few hundred people, most of whom had lived there their entire lives. Outsiders rarely ventured into Ash Hollow, and those who did often left with a sense of unease, as if the town itself were alive, watching them with unseen eyes. The town's history was steeped in mystery and folklore. The older residents spoke in hushed tones about the old times, a period long before any of them were born, when strange and terrible things were said to have happened in the woods surrounding Ash Hollow. There were stories of people vanishing without a trace, of ghostly figures seen wandering among the trees at night, and of a dark presence that was said to lurk deep within the forest, waiting for the unwary to venture too close. Most of the younger generation dismissed these stories as nothing more than superstitions, old wives' tales passed down through the years to keep children from straying too far into the woods. But there were those who believed, who knew, that there was something more to the stories, something darker and far more dangerous. One of those believers was a man named Samuel Reed. Sam had lived in Ash Hollow his entire life, and he had heard the stories from his grandparents, who had heard them from their grandparents before them. He had always felt a connection to the woods, a pull that drew him deeper into their shadows, despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. It was this connection that had led him to become the town's unofficial historian, collecting tales and legends from the older residents, compiling them into a journal that he kept hidden away in his small, cluttered home on the edge of the forest. Sam's obsession with the woods and their secrets had only grown stronger over the years, and he spent countless hours wandering among the trees, searching for answers to the questions that had haunted him since he was a child. One cool autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, Sam sat at his kitchen table, staring at the open journal in front of him. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and transcriptions of the stories he had gathered over the years, but there was one entry that he kept returning to, a story that had been told to him by an old woman named Martha Jenkins, just a few weeks before she passed away. Martha had been one of the oldest residents of Ash Hollow, her family having lived in the town for generations. She had told Sam about a place deep within the woods, a place that was known only to a few, where the trees grew so thick and tall that the sunlight never reached the forest floor. It was a place of darkness, she had said, where the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers of the dead could be heard on the wind. Martha had called it the Witch's Hollow. According to her story, the hollow had been the site of a great tragedy many years ago, when a woman accused of witchcraft had been hunted down by the townspeople and hanged from a great oak tree that stood in the center of the clearing. The woman's name had been Sarah Blackwood, and she had been a healer, known for her knowledge of herbs and potions. But when a mysterious illness swept through the town, killing dozens, the people had turned on her, blaming her for the deaths. In her final moments, as the noose tightened around her neck, Sarah had cursed the town, vowing that her spirit would remain in the hollow and that she would have her revenge on those who had wronged her. The townspeople, driven by fear and desperation, had ignored her words, but in the years that followed, strange and terrible things had begun to happen. People who ventured too deep into the woods began to disappear, their bodies never found. Those who did return spoke of hearing strange whispers in the trees, of feeling eyes watching them from the shadows. Some claimed to have seen a ghostly figure in the hollow, a woman with long dark hair and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. Sam had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but there was something about Martha's tale that had stuck with him, a nagging feeling that there was more to it than just superstition. He had tried to find the hollow, spending hours searching the woods, but it was as if the place didn't want to be found. The deeper he went, the more the trees seemed to close in around him, the paths twisting and turning until he was hopelessly lost. But tonight, as he stared at the pages of his journal, a decision formed in his mind. He would go back into the woods one last time, and he wouldn't return until he had found the Witch's Hollow. The next morning, Sam rose before dawn, packing a small bag with supplies, food, water, a flashlight, a compass, and a map of the area, though he knew it wouldn't be much help in the uncharted depths of the forest. He also brought his journal, tucking it into his coat pocket, along with a pencil to record anything he might find. As he stepped out of his house, the air was cool and crisp, the first light of dawn just beginning to creep over the horizon. The town was still asleep, the streets empty and silent, and Sam felt a sense of unease settle over him as he made his way to the edge of the woods. He hesitated for a moment at the tree line, looking back at the town, at the familiar streets and houses where he had spent his entire life. But the pull of the forest was too strong, and with a deep breath, he stepped into the shadows of the trees. The woods were quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustle of a bird in the branches above. The trees towered over him, their thick trunks and gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. As he walked, Sam kept his eyes and ears open, searching for any sign of the hollow. He had a vague sense of direction based on the stories he had heard, but the deeper he went, the more disoriented he became. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing denser and more twisted, their roots snaking across the ground like the fingers of some great ancient beast. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, though its light barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Sam paused to eat a quick lunch, sitting on a fallen log and glancing nervously around him. The woods were still, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After eating, Sam continued on his way, pushing deeper into the forest. The ground grew uneven and treacherous, the underbrush thick and tangled, making progress slow and difficult. Several times he had to stop and backtrack, the paths twisting and turning in ways that made no sense, as if the forest were deliberately trying to confuse him. But he pressed on, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. He had to find the hollow, had to know if the stories were true. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Sam knew he should turn back, should find a place to set up camp before darkness fell, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. There was something in the air, a tension that crackled just beneath the surface, and he felt as if he were on the verge of discovering something important, something that had been hidden for a long time. It was just as the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees that he saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance, deep within the forest. It was barely visible, a pale glow that seemed to pulse in the darkness, and Sam felt his heart skip a beat. He quickened his pace, pushing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that scratched at his face and hands. The light grew brighter as he drew closer, and he could see now that it was coming from a small clearing, the trees thinning out to reveal a patch of open ground. Sam stepped into the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The light was coming from a single source, a large ancient oak tree that stood in the center of the clearing, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. The tree's bark was blackened and cracked, as if it had been burned in some great fire, and at its base a circle of stones had been arranged, their surfaces worn smooth by time. This was the Witch's Hollow. As Sam approached the tree, he could feel a cold wind blowing through the clearing, the air thick with the scent of decay. The light, which he had seen from a distance, seemed to be emanating from the tree itself, a faint, otherworldly glow that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. He reached out to touch the tree's bark, but as his fingers brushed the rough surface, a sharp pain shot through his hand, and he yanked it back, hissing in pain. His palm was bleeding, a thin line of red running down his wrist, and he stared at it in shock, unsure of what had just happened. Before he could react, a voice whispered in his ear, soft and chilling, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." Sam spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there, only the dark, silent trees that surrounded the clearing. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Leave this place, now!" Sam's legs were shaking, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the tree. There was something about it, something that held him in place, as if the tree itself were alive, watching him with unseen eyes. And then, as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, he heard the whispers. They started out faint, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing second, until the air was filled with the sound of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, their words indistinguishable, a cacophony of sound that filled his mind, drowning out all thought. Sam clapped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voices were inside his head, echoing in his skull, driving him to the brink of madness. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground, the impact jarring him back to reality. The whispers faded, but the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. He had to get out of here, now. Sam scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for a way out. But the trees seemed to have closed in around him, their branches intertwining to form a solid wall of wood and leaves. He was trapped. Panic surged through him, and he ran toward the edge of the clearing, but no matter how fast he ran, the trees remained just out of reach, the darkness closing in around him. And then, just as he thought he would be lost forever, the trees parted, and he burst out of the clearing, back into the forest. He didn't stop running, didn't look back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the trees, the branches tearing at his clothes, the underbrush tripping him up at every turn. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stumbled out of the woods and onto the road that led back to Ash Hollow. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The forest was silent behind him, the clearing lost in the darkness, but he could still hear the whispers echoing in his mind, a reminder of the horror he had just escaped. But as he sat there gasping for breath, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He had left his journal behind, in the Witch's Hollow. Sam spent the next few days in a state of shock, unable to focus on anything but the events that had transpired in the woods. He kept to himself, barely leaving his house, his thoughts consumed by the memory of the whispers, of the tree, and of the journal he had left behind. The journal had been more than just a collection of stories. It had been his life's work, the culmination of years of research and obsession. And now it was gone, lost in the hollow, along with whatever secrets it might have contained. The thought gnawed at him, driving him to the brink of madness. He knew he should be relieved to have escaped the forest with his life, but all he could think about was the journal and the need to go back, to retrieve it, no matter the cost. It was this need, this overwhelming compulsion, that finally drove him to make the decision that would seal his fate. He would return to the Witch's Hollow. The decision wasn't made lightly. He knew the risks, knew that he might not survive another encounter with whatever dark force lurked in the hollow. But the pull was too strong, the need too great, and he found himself unable to resist. He spent the next few days preparing, gathering supplies, and mapping out a route that would take him back to the clearing. He knew he couldn't rely on the same path he had taken before. The forest was too unpredictable, too dangerous. Instead, he would follow a more direct route, using landmarks he had noted during his previous visit to guide him. The night before he was set to leave, Sam lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him in the woods. He knew he was walking into danger, knew that he might not return, but the fear was overshadowed by a grim determination, a resolve that had hardened in the days since his first encounter with the Hollow. He would go back, and this time, he would be ready. The next morning, just before dawn, Sam set out once again, his bag packed with supplies and a new journal tucked into his coat pocket. He followed the road out of town, the sky just beginning to lighten as he reached the edge of the forest. He hesitated for a moment, looking back at the town, at the safety and comfort it offered. But there was no turning back now, and with a deep breath, he stepped into the woods. The forest was just as he remembered it, dark, silent, and foreboding. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled and twisted, blocking out the light and casting the forest floor in deep shadows. But Sam pressed on, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. He moved quickly, navigating the uneven terrain with a practiced ease, his senses heightened by the knowledge of what lay ahead. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the scent of decay growing stronger, and he knew he was getting close. The trees began to thin out, the underbrush growing thicker, until finally he stepped into the clearing. The clearing was just as he had left it, the great oak tree standing in the center, its branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. The light, that eerie, otherworldly glow, still pulsed from the tree, casting the clearing in an unnatural light. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the tree, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the journal. But the ground was bare, the stones at the base of the tree undisturbed. And then he saw it, a small, black book lying in the shadows at the base of the tree, just out of reach. His journal. Sam's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of relief and fear washing over him. He had found it, had found the journal that had consumed his thoughts for days. But as he reached out to grab it, the whispers began. They started out faint, just as they had before, but they grew louder with each passing second, filling the air with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, a torrent of sound that threatened to overwhelm him. Sam froze, his hand hovering over the journal, his mind racing. He could feel the presence in the hollow, could feel it watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He knew he had to act quickly before the voices drove him mad. With a sudden burst of courage, he lunged forward, grabbing the journal and yanking it out of the shadows. The voices exploded in his mind, a deafening roar that sent him reeling backward, clutching the journal to his chest. The air grew cold, the light from the tree pulsing in time with the pounding of his heart. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the voices stopped. Sam stood there, panting, his heart racing, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The clearing was silent, the light from the tree fading, leaving him in darkness. He had done it. He had retrieved the journal. But as he turned to leave, to make his way back to the safety of the town, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart skipping a beat. But there was no one there, only the dark, silent trees that surrounded the clearing. And then he heard the voice, clear and cold, echoing in the darkness. "You cannot leave." Sam's blood ran cold, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, no one. And then the trees began to move. The branches twisted and writhed, their bark cracking and splitting as if the trees themselves were coming to life. The roots snaked across the ground, forming a barrier that blocked his path, trapping him in the hollow. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You cannot leave." Sam backed away, his heart pounding, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The trees closed in around him, the branches reaching out, their twisted fingers grasping for him. He was trapped. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the cold wind whipping through the clearing, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. Sam knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was not going to make it out of the hollow alive. The presence in the clearing was too strong, too powerful, and he had trespassed too far into its domain. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't let the forest claim him. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Sam turned and ran, the roots and branches tearing at his clothes, the voices in his mind driving him to the brink of madness. He ran through the forest, the trees closing in around him, the darkness swallowing him whole. He could feel the presence behind him, could feel it gaining on him, its cold breath on the back of his neck. But he didn't stop, didn't look back, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. And then, just as he thought he would be lost forever, the trees parted, and he burst out of the woods and onto the road that led back to Ash Hollow. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The forest was silent behind him, the clearing lost in the darkness, but he could still hear the whispers echoing in his mind, a reminder of the horror he had just escaped. But as he sat there, gasping for breath, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The journal was gone. Sam returned to Ash Hollow, a changed man. The experience in the Witch's Hollow had left him shaken, his mind haunted by the memories of the whispers, of the presence in the clearing, and of the journal he had lost. He tried to return to his old life, to forget what had happened in the woods, but the memories refused to fade. They lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the forest, just beyond the town's borders. The people of Ash Hollow noticed the change in him. He had always been a quiet man, but now he was distant, withdrawn, his eyes hollow and haunted. He rarely left his house, spending his days poring over old books and manuscripts, searching for answers to the questions that still plagued him. But no matter how hard he searched, he could find no explanation for what he had experienced in the hollow. The nights were the worst. The whispers, which had faded in the days following his return, grew louder as the sun set, filling his mind with the same cacophony of voices that had driven him from the hollow. They whispered to him in the darkness, taunting him, reminding him of the knowledge he had sought and the price he had paid. He couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the voices, no matter how hard he tried. The days and nights blurred together, a constant, unrelenting torment that drove him to the brink of madness. And then, one night, as he sat alone in his darkened house, the voices spoke to him. They were clear this time, their words distinct, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. Sam felt a cold shiver run down his spine, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the voices were not just in his mind. They were real as the forest, as real as the presence that had nearly claimed him. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, just before dawn, Sam set out for the woods once again. This time, he brought nothing with him, no supplies, no journal, no map. He didn't need them. The path was clear in his mind, etched into his memory by the voices that had haunted him for so long. The forest was silent as he entered, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching as he made his way deeper into the woods. The air was cold, the scent of decay growing stronger with each step he took, but he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He knew where he was going. It wasn't long before he reached the clearing. The great oak tree stood in the center, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky, the faint otherworldly glow pulsing from its bark. The stones at its base were undisturbed, the ground bare, as if nothing had changed since his last visit. Sam stepped into the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The voices were silent now, the air thick with tension, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. He approached the tree, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind filled with a grim resolve. He had come this far, had survived the horrors of the hollow, and now it was time to face whatever awaited him. As he reached out to touch the tree, the whispers returned, a low murmur that filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. But this time, he didn't pull away. He pressed his hand against the rough bark, feeling the cold, pulsing energy that emanated from the tree. And then the voices stopped. The clearing was silent, the air still, as if time itself had frozen. Sam stood there, his hand on the tree, waiting, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he heard it, a voice clear and cold, echoing in the darkness. "You have returned." Sam's blood ran cold, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, no one. And then the tree began to move. The bark split and cracked, the branches twisting and writhing, as if the tree were coming to life. The stones at its base trembled, the ground beneath them shifting and breaking apart. And then, from the center of the tree, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her form pale and ghostly, her hair long and dark, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She stepped out of the tree, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were waking from a long sleep. Sam stared in shock, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He knew who she was, knew her name, though he had never seen her before. Sarah Blackwood, the witch. She stepped toward him, her eyes fixed on his, a cold smile on her lips. "You sought knowledge," she said, her voice soft and chilling, "and you have found it." Sam couldn't move, couldn't speak, his mind frozen with fear. "You have trespassed in my domain," she continued, her voice growing colder, harsher. "And now you will pay the price." The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the cold wind whipping through the clearing, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. Sam felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he knew with a sickening certainty that he was not going to leave the hollow alive. The last thing he heard was the sound of the whispers, growing louder, filling his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. And then, darkness, The people of Ash Hollow spoke in hushed tones about Samuel Reed, the man who had disappeared into the woods and never returned. They told stories of his obsession with the Witch's Hollow, of the journal he had kept, filled with stories and legends of the dark history of the town. Some said he had gone mad, driven to the brink by the whispers in the woods. Others claimed he had been taken by the witch, her spirit still lingering in the hollow, waiting for those who dared to trespass in her domain. The older residents, those who remembered the stories of the old times, warned their children to stay away from the woods, to never venture too deep into the forest, for fear of what might be waiting for them in the darkness. And so, the legend of Ash Hollow grew, passed down from generation to generation. A story of a man who had sought knowledge and paid the ultimate price. But there were those who still ventured into the woods, drawn by the stories, by the mystery, by the allure of the unknown. And some said that on quiet nights, when the wind was still, you could hear the whispers echoing through the trees, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the town's borders. And those who heard the whispers knew, with a cold certainty, that the Witch's Hollow was not just a story, not just a legend. It was real, and it was waiting.
The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Emily Bennet first laid eyes on Blackwood Manor. The massive Victorian house stood at the edge of the small town of Ravenswood, shrouded in mystery and half-forgotten tales. Emily had never been to Ravenswood before, but she had heard stories about the old mansion from her grandmother, a woman who had spent her final years muttering about the curse that haunted the Bennet family. The house had been in her family for generations, passed down from one descendant to the next, but it had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, ever since Emily's great-uncle, Henry Bennet, disappeared without a trace. No one had lived there since, and the locals whispered that the house was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its walls. Emily wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but as she stood at the wrought-iron gate staring up at the towering spires and darkened windows of Blackwood Manor, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of her stomach. The house had been left to her in her grandmother's will, along with a cryptic note that read, "The answers you seek are within the walls of Blackwood Manor, but beware, for the past never stays buried." Emily had no idea what the note meant, but she was determined to find out. She had come to Ravenswood to claim her inheritance, to explore the old house, and perhaps to uncover the truth about her family's past. As she pushed open the creaking gate and made her way up the overgrown path to the front door, she couldn't help but feel that she was being watched. The wind rustled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to shift and move, as if something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. She reached the front door, a heavy ornate structure made of dark wood and iron, and inserted the old key her grandmother had left her. The lock turned with a loud click, and the door swung open with a groan, revealing a grand foyer bathed in dim light. The air inside was cool and musty, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Cobwebs hung from the high ceiling, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as Emily stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the distant ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep within the mansion. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. This was her family's home, and she had every right to be here. She would not be frightened by old ghost stories. She closed the door behind her and began to explore. The interior of Blackwood Manor was just as grand and just as eerie as its exterior. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the floors were covered in thick, ornate rugs that muffled her footsteps. The furniture was old and worn, covered in a fine layer of dust, but it was clear that the house had once been a place of luxury and wealth. What struck Emily most were the portraits that lined the walls, dozens of them, each one depicting a stern-faced ancestor, their eyes following her as she moved from room to room. The portraits were unsettling, their gazes almost lifelike, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, judging her. She paused in front of one particularly large portrait that hung in the main hallway. It depicted a tall, imposing man with dark hair and piercing eyes, dressed in a formal suit. His expression was severe, almost angry, and Emily found herself wondering who he was. As if in answer to her unspoken question, she noticed a small plaque beneath the portrait, engraved with the name Henry Bennett, her great-uncle. Emily stared at the portrait, her mind racing. This was the man who had disappeared all those years ago, the man who had left the house abandoned. What had happened to him? And why had her grandmother never spoken of him? The answers she knew were somewhere in this house. She just had to find them. As she continued her exploration, she found herself drawn to a narrow staircase at the back of the house, leading up to the second floor. The stairs creaked ominously as she ascended, the air growing colder with each step. The second floor was even darker than the first, the windows covered with heavy drapes that blocked out the light. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she walked down the long, narrow hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. It was the only room on this floor that wasn't locked, and as she approached, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was waiting for her on the other side. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a dresser, and a large ornate mirror on the wall. But what caught Emily's attention was the small writing desk in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. On the desk was an old, leather-bound journal. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she reached for the journal, her fingers trembling. She wiped away the dust and opened the cover, revealing pages filled with neat, cursive handwriting. The journal belonged to Henry Bennett. As Emily sat on the edge of the bed, she began to read the journal, her eyes scanning the yellowed pages with growing unease. The entries were dated from the late 1800s, and they detailed her great-uncle's life in Blackwood Manor, his dealings with the town of Ravenswood, and, most disturbingly, his growing obsession with the occult. Henry had been a man of science, a respected doctor in the community, but as the journal progressed, it became clear that something had changed him. The entries grew darker, more erratic, filled with descriptions of strange rituals and experiments conducted in secret within the manor's walls. One entry, dated October 31st, 1889, caught Emily's attention. It read, "The voices grow louder each night. They speak to me, whispering secrets of life and death, of power beyond imagination. I have discovered the truth. The veil between worlds is thin and it can be torn asunder. I must proceed with the ritual. The sacrifice is necessary. There is no other way." Emily's blood ran cold as she read the words. What had her great-uncle done? What ritual was he referring to? And what sacrifice? She turned the page, eager to find out more, but the next few pages were blank, as if Henry had stopped writing suddenly, his thoughts left unfinished. Frustrated, she flipped through the remaining pages, but they were all blank. The journal ended abruptly, with no explanation for what had happened to Henry Bennett, or the mysterious ritual he had mentioned. Emily closed the journal, her mind racing. She had more questions than ever, but the answers seemed just out of reach, buried in the dark history of Blackwood Manor. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a faint sound, a soft creak, like the sound of a door slowly opening. Her heart skipped a beat and she looked up, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there, only the shadows and the silence. She stood up, her nerves on edge, and made her way to the door, peering out into the hallway. The house was still, the only sound the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. But as she stepped into the hallway, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching her, something unseen and malevolent. She turned quickly, her eyes darting to the mirror on the wall. For a split second, she saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection, a tall, dark figure with piercing eyes, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. But when she spun around, the hallway was empty. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she backed away from the mirror, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it? Or was there something in this house, something that had been awakened by her presence? She didn't know, and she didn't want to find out. Clutching the journal to her chest, she fled down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. She needed to get out, needed to leave Blackwood Manor before it was too late. But as she reached the front door, she froze. The door was wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges. And standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, was a figure, a tall, dark figure with piercing eyes. Henry Bennett. Emily's scream caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward. his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a wave of terror through her entire being. "Emily," the figure said, his voice low and menacing. "You should not have come here." She backed away, her heart pounding, but there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. The house seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive as the figure advanced. "I was so close," Henry continued, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "So close to unlocking the secrets of life and death, but they stopped me. They took everything from me, and now they will take you too." The air grew cold, the temperature dropping rapidly as the figure reached out toward her, his hand ghostly pale, his fingers long and skeletal. Emily wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she was frozen in place, her body paralyzed with fear. And then, just as his fingers brushed against her skin, the lights flickered and went out. The house was plunged into darkness. Emily's scream finally tore free as she stumbled backward, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden darkness. She could hear Henry's voice, low and sinister, whispering her name, taunting her, but she couldn't see him, couldn't see anything. She fumbled in the darkness, her hands searching for something, anything that could help her find her way out. But the house seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the floor tilting beneath her feet. And then in the distance, she saw a faint light, flickering like a candle in the darkness. Without thinking, she ran toward it, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The light grew brighter as she approached, and she realized it was coming from the basement, from the narrow stairway that led down to the depths of Blackwood Manor. She hesitated for only a moment before descending the stairs, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The light flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but she kept going, driven by a desperate need to escape, to survive. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large, stone-walled chamber, the walls lined with strange symbols and markings that glowed faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room was an altar, and on the altar was a book, an old leather-bound tome, similar to the journal she had found upstairs. But this book was different, older, more sinister. As she approached the altar, she felt a strange pull, a compulsion to open the book, to read the words written within. She resisted at first, but the pull was too strong, the need too overwhelming. With trembling hands, she opened the book and began to read. The words were in a language she didn't understand, ancient and arcane. But as she read, she felt a strange sensation, as if the words were seeping into her mind, filling her with knowledge, with power. The room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay, and she could hear the distant sound of chanting, of voices whispering in the darkness. She looked up and saw Henry standing across the room, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You have begun the ritual," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You have unlocked the secrets of Blackwood Manor, now you must finish it." Emily shook her head, fear and confusion clouding her mind. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't want to understand, but the book was speaking to her, urging her to continue, to complete the ritual. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't do it. I won't." Henry's eyes narrowed, and he stepped forward, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "You have no choice," he said, his voice cold and final. "The ritual must be completed, the sacrifice must be made." Emily backed away, her heart pounding, but she couldn't escape the pull of the book, couldn't resist the compulsion to finish what had been started. The voices grew louder, the chanting more insistent, and she felt a cold, clammy hand on her shoulder, pulling her toward the altar. "No!" she screamed, trying to break free, but it was too late. The ritual had begun. The air in the chamber grew thick and suffocating as the chanting reached a fever pitch. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly energy that seemed to vibrate through Emily's very bones. Henry stood at the edge of the room, his eyes locked on hers, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. He had failed to complete the ritual all those years ago, and now he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The book in Emily's hands burned with a cold fire, the words on the pages twisting and shifting as if alive, compelling her to speak them aloud, to summon whatever dark force lay waiting in the shadows. She fought against it with every ounce of strength she had, but the power of the ritual was too strong. Her lips moved of their own accord, the ancient words spilling out in a language she couldn't understand, but somehow knew in the deepest recesses of her mind. As the final words left her lips, the room fell deathly silent. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still, the shadows unmoving. Emily dared to hope that she had somehow stopped the ritual, that it had all been a terrible dream. But then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The walls shook, the symbols glowing with an intense, blinding light. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the chamber, growing louder and more violent with each passing second. And then, from the darkness, something emerged. It was a presence, a force, unlike anything Emily had ever encountered. It was not human, not of this world, but something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting, watching, for centuries. The air grew cold as the presence filled the room, its power pressing down on Emily, suffocating her, drowning her in an overwhelming sense of despair and terror. Standing across the room where Henry had been was another figure, a woman, pale and ghostly, with long flowing hair and eyes that glowed with an eerie light. It was her grandmother. "Emily," the figure said, her voice soft and mournful, "you should never have come here." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she stared at the ghostly figure of her grandmother, the truth of the ritual finally sinking in. The sacrifice had not been of blood or flesh, but of something far more precious, her soul. As the figure of her grandmother began to fade, Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and she knew with a sickening certainty that she was now bound to Blackwood Manor, just as her ancestors had been before her. The ritual had been completed, the curse fulfilled, and there was no escape. The days and weeks that followed passed in a blur for the people of Ravenswood. They spoke in hushed tones about the strange lights and sounds that had come from Blackwood Manor on that fateful night, and they whispered about Emily Bennet, the young woman who had come to claim her inheritance and had never been seen again. The authorities searched the house, but they found no sign of Emily, only an old, dusty journal and a book filled with strange, indecipherable symbols. The house was sealed off, declared unsafe, but the townspeople knew the truth. Blackwood Manor was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had perished within its walls, bound forever by the dark rituals that had been performed there. And so the house was left to rot, abandoned and forgotten, a relic of a dark past that refused to stay buried. But the legend of Blackwood Manor lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a tale of a family cursed by their own ambition, of a young woman who had sought answers and paid the ultimate price. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees, the people of Ravenswood would tell the story of Emily Bennet, the last of the Bennet line, and the dark force that still waited in the shadows of Blackwood Manor, waiting for the next soul to claim. The night was unnervingly quiet as Ava Thompson drove down the narrow, winding road leading to the outskirts of her hometown, Crestfall. She hadn't been back in years, but when she'd received the news about her uncle's death, she knew she had no choice. The old man had been her only living relative, and he'd left her something important, according to the lawyer. Ava glanced at the faded map on the passenger seat, the only guide she had to the location of the mysterious inheritance. Her uncle's lawyer had been cryptic, telling her that she needed to see it in person to understand. All Ava knew was that it involved an old property her uncle had purchased years ago, one that had a reputation among the locals as a place best forgotten, the Crestfall Asylum. Ava had heard stories about the asylum when she was a child. It had been shut down decades ago after a fire destroyed most of the building, killing several patients and staff. Some said the fire was an accident. Others whispered that it was started deliberately by one of the inmates, an inmate who had vanished in the chaos and was never found. The place had been abandoned ever since, left to rot and decay. It was said to be haunted, cursed even, but Ava had never been one to believe in ghost stories. Still, as she approached the rusted iron gates of the asylum, a shiver ran down her spine. The place was a hulking ruin, its once grand facade now covered in ivy and creeping vines. The windows were broken and the doors hung askew, as if the building itself was trying to keep something inside. Ava parked her car outside the gates and got out, her breath visible in the chilly night air. She pushed open the gate, the hinges screeching in protest, and made her way up the cracked stone path to the entrance. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls. She reached the front doors and hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. Something about this place felt wrong, but she had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was even worse than she had imagined. The walls were blackened with soot, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, and the remnants of old medical equipment. The air was stale and musty, heavy with the weight of years of neglect. Ava pulled out her flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The light revealed a grand staircase leading up to the second floor, its banister cracked and splintered. To her left was a hallway leading deeper into the building, its walls lined with peeling paint and faded, water-stained wallpaper. She took a step forward, her foot crunching on something brittle, and froze. There was a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering, like the sound of a distant conversation. It was so faint that she wasn't sure if she was imagining it, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She shook her head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled over her. She was being ridiculous. The place was old, decrepit. Of course it would make strange noises. But as she continued down the hallway, the whispering grew louder, more distinct, until she could almost make out words. She stopped in front of a door, its wood warped and cracked, and listened. The whispering was coming from inside, a low murmuring sound that seemed to crawl under her skin and settle in her bones. She reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in yellowed, curling wallpaper, and a single, dusty chair sat in the center of the room. There was nothing else, no windows, no furniture, nothing to explain the whispering, but the sound was still there, filling the room surrounding her. Ava stepped inside, her heart pounding, and the door slammed shut behind her. Ava spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls, but there was no one there. The door was closed, the room empty, yet the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. She pressed her back against the door, her pulse racing, and tried to steady her breathing. She told herself it was just the wind, the old building settling, anything to rationalize the unnatural sound that seemed to be all around her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The voices were real and they were getting closer. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the sound to go away, but it only intensified, becoming a cacophony of murmurs and half-heard words that seemed to burrow into her mind. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, and Ava slowly opened her eyes, half expecting to see something standing in front of her. But the room was still empty. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, and reached for the door handle. It turned easily, and she pushed the door open, eager to get out of the stifling room and away from the oppressive silence. But as she stepped back into the hallway, she felt a sudden chill, a cold draft that seemed to seep into her bones. She shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her, but the cold persisted, gnawing at her, making her feel weak and disoriented. She needed to find whatever it was her uncle had left her and get out of this place. The hallway stretched out before her, dim and foreboding, and she could barely make out the outline of the staircase at the far end. She started toward it, her footsteps echoing off the walls, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The farther she went, the colder it became until she was shivering uncontrollably, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The flashlight flickered, the beam dimming, and she quickened her pace, desperate to reach the staircase, to get out of this place before... The whispering started again. This time it was louder, more distinct, and Ava could hear the words, disjointed and fragmented, but unmistakable. "She's here, she's come back, she'll join us, forever." Panic surged through her, and she broke into a run, her footsteps pounding against the floor. She reached the staircase and took the steps two at a time, the whispering growing louder, more urgent, as if the voices were right behind her, chasing her, pulling her back into the darkness. She reached the top of the stairs and stopped, gasping for breath, her eyes scanning the darkened hallway. There were more doors here, their paint chipped and peeling, and she had no idea which one to choose, which one would lead her to whatever it was she was supposed to find. But there was no time to think. No time to hesitate. She chose the door closest to her and shoved it open, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind her. The room was dark, the only light coming from her flickering flashlight. She could barely make out the shape of a large wooden desk in the center of the room, its surface covered in dust and old papers. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It pressed in on her, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. She crossed the room to the desk, her hands shaking as she rifled through the papers, searching for something, anything that would tell her what she was supposed to do. And then she saw it, a small black key lying in the center of the desk, half buried under a stack of yellowed documents. Ava picked it up, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic, and a shock of pain shot through her, as if the key had burned her. She gasped and dropped it, the key clattering to the floor. The whispering started again, louder and more frantic, the voices overlapping, merging into a single maddening chorus. "Take it, take it, take it." Ava dropped to her knees, her hands fumbling for the key, but it was as if the room itself was fighting against her, the cold seeping into her bones, sapping her strength. She grabbed the key and stumbled to her feet, clutching it tightly in her hand. The pain was still there, a searing, burning sensation that pulsed through her entire body, but she couldn't let go. The key was important, she knew that now, but she had no idea why or what it was supposed to unlock. As she staggered to the door, the voices screaming in her ears, and flung it open. The hallway was empty, the cold even more intense than before, and she could barely see through the darkness that seemed to cling to everything. But she didn't care. She ran, the key clutched in her hand, the voices chasing her, pulling at her, trying to drag her back into the shadows. She reached the end of the hallway and saw a door, larger and more ornate than the others, its surface covered in strange, intricate carvings. She knew instinctively that this was the door the key was meant for. She shoved the key into the lock, the metal searing her hand, and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. A cold, damp draft wafted up from the depths, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. Ava hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the voices were relentless, their whispers clawing at her mind, urging her forward. Join us, forever." With no other choice, she stepped onto the staircase, the wood groaning under her weight. The door slammed shut behind her, the finality of the sound echoing in the confined space, trapping her in the suffocating darkness. Ava's flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unstable, barely illuminating the steps in front of her. She descended slowly, each step taking her deeper into the cold, oppressive void. The whispers seemed to intensify, surrounding her from all sides, their words a twisted mockery of comfort and invitation. At the bottom of the stairs, Ava found herself in a long, narrow corridor, its walls lined with crumbling brick and rusted metal pipes. The air was thick with moisture and the cold was unbearable, seeping into her bones, numbing her senses. Her flashlight flickered again, and then, with a soft pop, it went out, plunging her into total darkness. Panic surged through her, but before she could react, a faint light appeared at the far end of the corridor, a dim, ghostly glow that beckoned her forward. She had no choice but to follow it, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the voices growing louder with every step. As she approached the light, she could make out the shape of a large iron door at the end of the corridor, its surface covered in the same strange carvings as the door upstairs. The light seemed to emanate from within, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Ava reached the door and hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The voices were deafening now, a cacophony of screams and whispers that filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. "Open it, open the door, let us in." She couldn't resist. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, its walls covered in more of the strange carvings, the floor a patchwork of cracked stone and dirt. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. The source of the light was a single, flickering candle that sat on the altar, its flame barely holding on in the still, cold air. Ava approached the altar, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The voices were screaming now, their words a jumbled mess of madness and desperation, urging her to do something she couldn't understand. And then she saw it, a book, ancient and tattered, lying on the altar next to the candle. Its cover was blackened with age, its pages yellowed and brittle. The title was written in a language she didn't recognize, the letters twisted and jagged, like the carvings on the walls. She reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed the cover, the voices stopped. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. The cold seemed to retreat, replaced by a stifling heat that pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. And then the book opened on its own, its pages flipping wildly, as if caught in a strong wind. The candle flame flared, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, and the room began to shake, the ground beneath her feet rumbling with a deep, ominous growl. Ava stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror, as the book settled on a page near the middle. The words on the page glowed with an unnatural light, pulsing with a dark energy that filled the room with a sense of dread and despair. She couldn't look away, her gaze locked on the words that seemed to crawl across the page, twisting and writhing like living things. And then she understood. The book wasn't just a book. It was a doorway, a portal to something ancient and malevolent, something that had been trapped here for centuries, waiting for someone to set it free. The voices returned, no longer whispering but screaming, their words a twisted chant. Release us, release us, release us. Ava felt herself being pulled toward the book, her body moving of its own accord, her hand reaching out to touch the glowing words. The heat was unbearable now, the air thick with the stench of burning flesh and sulfur, but she couldn't stop herself. She touched the page, and the world exploded into darkness. The last thing Ava heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of the door slamming shut, sealing her fate. And in the silence that followed, the voices faded, leaving only the echo of their final chilling whisper, "Welcome home."
The echoes of Blackwood House. Lena Grant had never heard of Blackwood House until the day she inherited it. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, its contents stark and brief. It informed her that she was the sole heir to her late aunt, Margaret Blackwood, a woman Lena had never met or even heard of. The letter included the keys to the house, a remote property in the deep woods of New Hampshire, along with instructions to visit the estate as soon as possible to settle the inheritance. Curiosity outweighed caution, and Lena, always one for an adventure, decided to see this mysterious house for herself. With no family to speak of and a life that felt increasingly empty, she was eager for a change of pace, no matter how strange the circumstances. The drive to Blackwood House took longer than expected. The GPS lost signal miles before she reached the town of Hollow Creek, forcing her to rely on the map provided with the letter. The winding, narrow road leading to the house was overgrown and nearly impassable. But after what felt like hours of navigating treacherous terrain, she finally reached the gate. The house loomed before her, a massive, crumbling edifice that seemed to have been plucked from another century. Ivy clung to the stone walls, and the windows were dark, lifeless eyes staring out into the dense forest that encircled the property. The gate creaked as Lena pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent woods like a warning. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as Lena made her way up the stone path to the front door. She hesitated, the weight of the keys heavy in her hand, before inserting one into the lock. The door opened with a groan, revealing a dark foyer, the interior as cold and unwelcoming as the exterior. Lena stepped inside, her footsteps echoing off the marble floor. The air was stale, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. The house was huge, with high ceilings and long hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, their eyes following her as she moved through the rooms. There was an unsettling stillness to the place, as if it had been frozen in time. It was clear that no one had lived here for years, maybe decades, yet everything was perfectly preserved, as if waiting for someone to return. Lena's unease grew as she explored the house. There was something off about it, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't just the silence or the dust, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of her vision. It was a feeling, a sense of being watched, of not being alone. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger the deeper she ventured into the house. By the time she reached the grand staircase that led to the upper floors, she was on edge, her nerves frayed and her heart pounding in her chest. The staircase creaked under her weight as she ascended, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The second floor was even darker than the first, the heavy drapes drawn over the windows, blocking out what little light there was. She reached for a nearby lamp, and to her surprise, found that it worked, casting a dim, flickering light that did little to dispel the shadows. Lena made her way down the hallway, stopping at each door to peer inside. Most of the rooms were bedrooms, each one more decayed and dilapidated than the last. The beds were still made, the sheets yellowed with age, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. At the end of the hallway was a door that stood out from the others. It was smaller, almost hidden in the shadows, and when Lena tried the handle, she found it locked. She hesitated for a moment before remembering the ring of keys in her pocket. She fumbled with them, trying one after another until she found the right one. The door swung open with a soft click, revealing a small, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something else, something metallic. Lena's heart skipped a beat. This was the basement, she realized. She had yet to explore it, but something about the darkness below made her hesitate. There was an oppressive, almost malevolent energy emanating from the space, and every instinct she had screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But she couldn't. Something drew her forward, an inexplicable compulsion to see what lay below. She fished out her phone, turning on the flashlight app, and began her descent. The stairs were steep and narrow, and each step echoed in the confined space. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It was the smell of blood, she realized, and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a large, open space. The walls were made of rough stone, and the floor was dirt, uneven and damp. Her flashlight flickered as she swept it across the room, revealing a large wooden table in the center, covered in dust and cobwebs. But it was what lay beyond the table that made her blood run cold. A row of iron cages lined the far wall, each one barely large enough to hold a person. They were old, rusted, the bars bent and broken in places. But what terrified Lena was that they were not empty. The skeletal remains of several people lay inside the cages, their bones picked clean, their empty eye sockets staring out at her accusingly. Lena gasped, stumbling back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She wanted to run, to get out of this nightmare, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen with terror. She wasn't alone in this house. She had never been alone. The sound of footsteps echoed through the basement, and Lena spun around, her flashlight beam jerking wildly as she searched for the source. But there was no one there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they were right behind her. She turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but the basement was empty. The only sound was her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her heart in her ears. And then the whispering started. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire room. The voices overlapped, merging into a single, incomprehensible chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lena backed away, her hands shaking, her heart hammering in her chest. She had to get out, had to leave this place before it was too late. But as she turned to flee, something caught her eye. On the far wall, just beyond the cages, was a door she hadn't noticed before. It was made of heavy iron-bound wood, and it was ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and Lena felt a strange pull toward the door, a compulsion to see what lay beyond. Against her better judgment, she moved toward it, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She reached out, hesitating for only a moment before pushing the door open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, the walls lined with shelves filled with books and jars of strange, preserved specimens. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. But it was what lay on the altar that made Lena's blood run cold. A small black book, bound in leather and covered in strange symbols, lay open on the altar, its pages filled with intricate, arcane writing that seemed to writhe and twist on the page. As she approached, the whispering grew louder, more frantic, the voices merging into a single, deafening scream that echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of overwhelming dread. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, and Lena slowly reached out, her hand trembling, to touch the book. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, a shock of pain shot through her, and the world exploded into darkness. Lena woke to the sound of a low, rhythmic chant. It was deep and resonant, like the sound of distant thunder, and it seemed to vibrate through her entire body. She was lying on something hard and cold, her arms and legs bound to it by thick, rough ropes. Panic surged through her as she tried to move, but the ropes held tight, digging into her skin. Her head throbbed with pain, and her vision was blurred, the room spinning as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. She was still in the small, dimly lit room, but now it was filled with shadows, dark shapes that moved and writhed in the corners of her vision. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and she realized with a jolt of terror that it was coming from the book on the altar, the pages glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Lena struggled against her bonds, trying to break free, but it was no use. The ropes were too tight, too strong, and she could feel them cutting into her skin, warm blood trickling down her arms and legs. The chanting grew louder, reverberating through the small chamber until it felt as though the sound was coming from within Lena's own skull. She writhed against the ropes binding her to the stone altar, her skin crawling with the sensation of something unseen pressing down on her, suffocating her. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse and expand, creeping closer with each passing second. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as she watched them coalesce into vaguely humanoid forms, their indistinct features twisted in ways that defied comprehension. These were not people, not anymore. They were something else, something ancient and malevolent. With each pulse of the chanting, the air in the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting until Lena could see her breath misting in front of her. Her teeth began to chatter uncontrollably, and the ropes binding her to the altar seemed to tighten, cutting off her circulation. The book on the altar suddenly snapped shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. The chanting ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on Lena like a physical weight. She could feel the malevolent presence in the room thickening, congealing around her, as though the very darkness itself was alive and hungry. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the room. It was unlike the whispering Lena had heard before. This voice was powerful, commanding, filled with an authority that brooked no defiance. Lena staggered toward the door, the shadows lunging at her, trying to pull her back into the darkness. She swatted them away, feeling their icy tendrils slice through the air around her, but she kept moving, refusing to look back. She reached the door and flung it open, stumbling into the dark hallway beyond. The house was a labyrinth of shadows and echoing whispers, but Lena didn't care. She had to find a way out. She ran through the darkened corridors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to shift and change around her, the walls closing in, the floor warping beneath her feet. The portraits lining the walls twisted and contorted, their eyes following her with malevolent glee. As she reached the grand staircase, the shadows surged up from the basement, a wave of darkness that threatened to engulf her. Lena hesitated for only a moment before she bolted up the stairs, the sound of her footsteps drowned out by the cacophony of whispering voices chasing her. She reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the hallway that led to the front door. The house seemed to sense her intentions, the shadows thickening around her, blocking her path. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was running out of time. Then, from somewhere deep within her mind, a memory surfaced, a fragment of a story her mother had told her when she was a child, a story about an ancient curse that had plagued her family for generations, a curse that could only be broken by the last of the bloodline. The memory was vague, fragmented, but Lena clung to it as her only hope. If she could find the source of the curse, maybe she could end it, end all of this. But where? The answer came to her in a flash of intuition, a sudden, overwhelming certainty that she had to go back to the basement. The very thought filled her with dread, but she knew it was the only way. With a deep breath, Lena turned and raced back down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows reached out for her, but she was faster, driven by a desperation she had never known. She reached the basement door and hesitated only for a moment before flinging it open and plunging down the stairs. The cold air hit her like a wall, but she pushed through, her eyes locked on the door at the far end of the room, the door that had led to the chamber where she had found the book. The iron-bound door was still ajar, the faint light spilling out into the darkness. Lena forced herself to move forward, her hands trembling as she pushed the door open wider. The room was just as she had left it, the stone altar at the center, the shelves lining the walls. But the book was gone, replaced by a small, dark object that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. Lena approached the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the dark energy emanating from the object, a tangible force that pushed against her, trying to drive her away. But she didn't stop. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the object. A surge of pain shot through her, and the world exploded into darkness. When Lena awoke, she was no longer in the basement. The oppressive darkness, the cold stone floor, the smell of decay, all of it was gone. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of a vast, desolate landscape, a place that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. The sky was an unnatural shade of black, with no stars, no moon, nothing to break the endless void above. The ground was cracked and barren, devoid of any life, and the air was thick with the scent of sulfur and ash. Lena's heart raced as she looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was alone, but she could feel the presence of something or someone watching her, waiting. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon, and then she saw it. A figure standing far off in the distance, shrouded in shadows. The figure was tall and thin, its form indistinct and shifting, as if it were made of the same darkness that surrounded them. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Lena could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, fixed on her. A sense of overwhelming dread washed over her, and she took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was or how she had gotten here, but she knew she had to get away from that figure. But as she turned to run, the figure spoke. "Lena Blackwood," it said, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the empty landscape. "You cannot escape your fate." Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure began to move toward her, gliding across the ground as if it were weightless. "What do you want?" Lena demanded, her voice trembling. "Why am I here?" The figure stopped a few feet away from her, its form still shrouded in shadows. "You are here because you are the last of the Blackwood line. The curse that has plagued your family for generations now rests upon you." "I don't know anything about a curse," Lena protested, her mind racing. "I don't even know who you are." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. "I am the one who was wronged," it said slowly. "The one who was betrayed by your ancestors. The one who placed the curse upon your bloodline." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" The figure's voice grew colder. "Centuries ago, your ancestor made a pact with me, a pact sealed in blood. But when the time came to fulfill his end of the bargain, he betrayed me." The figure's form seemed to shift, becoming darker, more menacing. "The curse can only be broken by the blood of the last Blackwood. You must complete the ritual your ancestor failed to finish." Lena's blood ran cold. "And if I refuse?" The figure's eyes, two pinpricks of red light, gleamed from within the shadows. "Then the curse will continue, and you will join the others, those who came before you, who tried to defy their fate." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. The skeletal remains she had seen in the basement flashed through her mind, the bones of her ancestors, trapped in this nightmare for all eternity. She couldn't let that happen to her. She couldn't become another victim of this curse. But the thought of completing the ritual, of giving in to this malevolent force, filled her with a deep, primal fear. What would it mean for her? What would she have to sacrifice? As if sensing her hesitation, the figure spoke again. There is no other way, Lena. You cannot escape this. You cannot run from your fate. Lena clenched her fists, her mind racing. She didn't want to die, didn't want to be trapped in this nightmare forever. But she also didn't want to be the one to perpetuate this curse, to condemn others to the same fate. She had to find a way out, had to break the cycle once and for all. But how? Her eyes darted around the barren landscape, searching for anything that could help her. And then she remembered the object she had found on the altar, the one that had brought her here. The figure seemed to sense her thoughts, and its form grew darker, more solid. "You cannot resist, Lena," it said, its voice growing harsher. "The ritual must be completed." Lena backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. "There has to be another way." But the figure advanced on her, its shadowy form stretching out toward her. "There is no other way," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You will complete the ritual, or you will suffer." Lena's mind raced as she tried to think of a plan, some way to escape this nightmare. But the figure was closing in on her, its dark energy pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then, in a moment of clarity, she realized what she had to do. The object on the altar, the one that had brought her here, it was the key. If she could destroy it, maybe she could break the curse, end this once and for all. The figure was almost upon her now, its shadowy form towering over her, its red eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Lena could feel the darkness closing in around her, choking her, suffocating her. With a surge of desperation, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the object, the small, dark object that pulsed with a faint, malevolent light. She held it up, her hand shaking, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering and wavering. "No!" the figure screamed, its voice filled with rage. "You cannot destroy it!" Lena ignored the figure's words, focusing all her energy on the object in her hand. She could feel the dark energy emanating from it, a tangible force that pushed against her, trying to drive her away. But she didn't stop. She held the object tighter, her hand trembling with the effort. And then, with a final, desperate push, she smashed it against the ground. The object shattered with a blinding flash of light, and the world around her exploded into chaos. The ground shook, the sky cracked open, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream as it dissolved into nothingness. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms disintegrating in the light. The dark energy that had surrounded Lena dissipated, leaving her gasping for breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The sky returned to its unnatural shade of black. The ground stopped shaking, and the silence that followed was deafening. Lena fell to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had broken the curse. But as she looked around the barren landscape, she realized that she was still here, still trapped in this nightmare. And then she understood. The curse had been broken, but the price had been her freedom. She had saved her descendants, but she was now trapped in this desolate place, alone for all eternity. As the weight of her fate settled over her, Lena felt a single tear slide down her cheek. She had sacrificed everything to break the cycle, to end the suffering, and in doing so, she had condemned herself to a different kind of torment. But she knew deep down that it had been worth it. The last of the Blackwoods would not suffer the same fate as those who had come before. And as Lena sat alone in the endless void, she found peace. For she had become the final echo of Blackwood House, the one who had ended the curse, and the one who would be remembered in the whispers of those who came after. Years passed, and Blackwood House stood silent and abandoned in the deep woods of New Hampshire, its secrets buried along with the last of its cursed bloodline. The locals whispered of the haunted mansion deep in the woods, warning their children never to stray too far into the forest. But the house remained, a dark reminder of the horrors that had once plagued the Blackwood family. It was said that on certain nights, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the faint echoes of a woman's voice, carried on the breeze, a voice that had once belonged to Lena Blackwood, the last of her line. And those who were brave or foolish enough to venture into the woods at night would sometimes catch a glimpse of her, standing in the doorway of the old mansion, her eyes hollow, her face etched with the pain of her eternal torment. But the curse was broken, and the bloodline was free. And so Blackwood House, once a place of unimaginable suffering, was left to crumble and decay, a relic of a time long past, its dark legacy fading into myth and legend. But the echoes of that terrible night still lingered, whispering through the trees, a warning to all who dared to listen. Some curses are meant to be broken, but others are meant to be endured. And Lena Blackwood had done both, for she was the last echo of Blackwood House, and she would remain forever. It started with a signal, a faint blip on the radar screen at the small observatory in upstate New York, where I worked as a night shift technician. I had spent countless hours monitoring the skies, scanning the cosmos for anything unusual, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found that night. It was a quiet evening, the kind that had become routine after months of uneventful shifts. The other staff had already gone home, leaving me alone with the comforting hum of the equipment and the distant chirping of crickets outside. I was scrolling through endless lines of data when a sudden spike caught my attention, a burst of energy from a distant part of the sky, unlike anything I had seen before. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Equipment malfunctions were not uncommon, especially with our aging gear. But as I analyzed the signal further, I realized it was something different. The pattern was too regular, too precise to be random noise. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate. I immediately recorded the signal and ran it through every filter and algorithm at my disposal. It was no natural phenomenon, that much was clear. The signal was repeating in a complex sequence, a series of numbers and tones that seemed almost deliberate. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. I knew what this could mean, but I also knew the implications of jumping to conclusions. Still, the thought crept into my mind. Could this be contact? I spent the next several hours working feverishly to decode the signal. It was incredibly complex, far beyond anything we had ever intercepted from deep space. The pattern seemed to hint at an advanced intelligence, something far beyond our understanding. I sent a message to my supervisor, Dr. Emily Rhodes, detailing my findings. She was one of the leading astrophysicists in the country and had always been open to the possibility of extraterrestrial life. If anyone could make sense of this, it would be her. But as the hours passed and I waited for a response, something strange began to happen. The signal grew stronger, more insistent, as if whatever was sending it knew I was listening. The regular pulses of energy became erratic, almost frantic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't long before I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Flickers of movement on the security monitors, shadows that shouldn't have been there. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. When Dr. Rhodes finally responded, she was excited, almost giddy with the implications of what I had discovered. She instructed me to keep monitoring the signal and promised to come to the observatory first thing in the morning, but I wasn't sure I'd make it through the night. The signal continued to grow in intensity, pulsing through the equipment with a force that made the entire building tremble. The power surged, causing the lights to flicker and the monitors to flash ominously. I tried to stay focused, to keep recording the data, but the unease gnawing at my gut was impossible to ignore. It was around midnight when I heard it, an otherworldly hum that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the observatory. It wasn't coming from the equipment, it was something else, something that vibrated through the air and rattled my bones. The sound was low, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder and more distinct with each passing minute. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the main hall, my heart pounding in my chest. The hum was coming from outside, drawing me toward the large observation windows that overlooked the surrounding woods. As I approached, I could see a strange glow in the distance, a soft, pulsating light that bathed the trees in an eerie, unnatural hue. I hesitated for only a moment before I pushed open the door and stepped outside. The cool night air hit me like a wave, but it did nothing to calm the rising panic in my chest. The light was coming from the sky, a strange, shimmering beam that seemed to descend from the heavens and touch down in the forest just beyond the observatory. I stood there, frozen in place, as the light grew brighter, the hum louder, until the ground beneath me began to tremble. It was like nothing I had ever seen, beautiful and terrifying all at once. My mind raced with possibilities, but there was only one conclusion that made sense. They were here. The light intensified, and for a moment I had to shield my eyes from the blinding brilliance. When I looked again, I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the light. They were tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and smooth, featureless faces that seemed to shimmer and shift like liquid metal. Their bodies were slender, almost delicate, and they moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. There was an otherworldly quality to them, something that defied explanation, as if they were made of pure energy. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by a mix of awe and terror. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching me with those blank, expressionless faces. And then, as if they had come to a decision, they began to move toward me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the ground. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted back into the observatory. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But I knew it wouldn't keep them out. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had to warn someone, had to let the world know what was happening. But as I reached for the phone, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the observatory into darkness. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest, in my bones. I could sense them outside, just beyond the walls, their presence pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. And then, without warning, the door began to creak open. The door swung open slowly, almost deliberately, revealing the pitch-black night beyond. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. The hum filled the air, resonating through the building, making it feel as though the very structure was trembling. And then they were there. One of the figures stepped forward, closer than before, and I felt a wave of intense pressure in my head, a sharp pain that made me cry out. It was as if something was being pulled from my mind, something I couldn't quite grasp. And then, in a voice that echoed in my thoughts, I heard it. "We have chosen." The pain intensified, and I felt myself slipping away, my consciousness fading into darkness. I tried to fight it, to hold on, but it was too strong, too overwhelming. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the figure's hand, reaching out toward me once more. And then, nothing. When I woke, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the observatory. The lights were back on, flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the room. My head throbbed with a dull ache, and I felt disoriented, as if I had been asleep for days. But I wasn't alone. Dr. Rhodes was standing over me, her face a mix of concern and confusion. "Thank God you're awake," she said, helping me to my feet. "What happened here? I got your message, and when I arrived, the place was in chaos. The equipment is fried, and you were lying on the floor, unconscious." I struggled to find the words, my mind still reeling from the encounter. They were here," I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Rhodes frowned. "Who was here?" "Them," I said, my voice trembling. "The ones who sent the signal, they found me." She looked at me as if I had lost my mind, and in that moment, I wondered if I had. The memories of what had happened were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror, but the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I had seen, what I had felt? How could I make her understand that something beyond our comprehension had made contact, and that they had chosen me for something? Dr. Rhodes led me to a chair and handed me a glass of water. "Take it easy," she said, her voice calm and soothing. "You've been through a lot. Just try to relax and tell me what you remember." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I told her about the signal, about the figures in the forest, about the encounter in the observatory. But as I spoke, I could see the skepticism in her eyes, the doubt that crept into her expression. "It sounds like you had a vivid hallucination," she said gently. The stress of the job, the isolation. It's not uncommon for people in our field to experience things like this. I shook my head. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. They were real. She didn't argue, but I could tell she didn't believe me. And who could blame her? The whole thing sounded insane, like something out of a bad science fiction movie. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. When I woke, I was in the void again, floating in that endless darkness, the voices whispering in my mind. But this time, something was different. The whispers were clearer, the words more distinct. They were no longer out of reach. "We have chosen," the voices said, echoing in my mind. "You are the one." The pain in my head intensified, and I felt something shift inside me, something breaking free. It was as if a floodgate had been opened, and a torrent of images, memories, and thoughts poured into my mind. I saw worlds beyond imagining, alien landscapes bathed in strange, unearthly light. I saw beings of pure energy, their forms shifting and changing like liquid. I saw ancient civilizations, long since vanished, their ruins scattered across the cosmos. And I saw them, the ones who had come to me. I saw their world, their technology, their purpose. They were travelers, explorers of the universe, seeking knowledge and understanding. But they were also something more, something ancient and powerful, with motives that went beyond human comprehension. And I was their chosen one. The knowledge flooded my mind, overwhelming me, drowning me in a sea of information. I could feel them inside me, their thoughts mingling with mine, their presence merging with my consciousness. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. I was back in my apartment, lying in bed, the pain in my head gone, replaced by a strange, unsettling calm. The figures were gone, and the room was empty. But I knew they were still with me, inside me, a part of me. I had been chosen, and I understood what that meant. I knew what I had to do. The knowledge they had given me was too much for one person to bear, too dangerous to keep hidden. I had to share it, to let the world know what was coming. I returned to the observatory, breaking in late at night, when I knew no one would be there. The equipment had been repaired, the signal long since forgotten, but I knew how to find it, how to reach out to them. I activated the transmitter, tuning it to the frequency I had discovered months ago. The hum returned, that familiar, eerie vibration that resonated through the building, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. I began to broadcast, sending out the message that had been implanted in my mind. I spoke of the visitors, of their world, of the knowledge they had shared with me. I spoke of their plans, their intentions, their purpose, and I warned of what was to come. As I spoke, I could feel them listening, their presence growing stronger, more insistent. The pain in my head returned, sharper than before, but I pushed through it, knowing that this was my last chance to be heard. The lights flickered, the power surged, and I knew they were coming for me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to finish the transmission, had to make sure the message got through. And then, just as I was about to complete the broadcast, they arrived. The equipment short-circuited, the lights exploded in a shower of sparks, and the air was filled with that terrible, otherworldly hum. They were there, in the room with me, their forms barely visible in the darkness. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, their presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. The pain in my head was unbearable, a searing, white-hot agony that threatened to tear me apart. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had to finish. I reached for the transmitter, my vision blurring, my hands trembling. I could hear them in my mind, their voices growing louder, more insistent, demanding that I stop. But I didn't. With the last of my strength, I completed the transmission, sending the final message out into the void. And then, everything went dark. When they found me, I was lying on the floor of the observatory, unconscious but alive. The equipment was destroyed, the building in disarray, but the transmission had gone through. The message had been sent. They tried to keep it quiet, tried to cover up what had happened, but the truth couldn't be contained. The signal had been intercepted by observatories around the world, the message spreading like wildfire through the scientific community. There was no denying it now. They were out there, and they were coming. As for me, I was taken to a facility, a place where they could keep an eye on me, monitor me. They said it was for my own good, that I needed help, but I knew the truth. They were afraid of what I had become. The knowledge was still inside me, the memories, the thoughts. I could feel them, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I had been chosen, and I knew that one day they would return. But until then, I would wait, and I would remember. It's been years since that night, years since I first made contact with the visitors. The world has changed, the truth slowly seeping into the public consciousness. But there are still those who refuse to believe, who cling to the old ways, the old fears. But I know better. They've been watching us, studying us, preparing for the day when they will reveal themselves fully. I can feel it in the air, in the subtle shifts in the world around me. The time is coming, the moment when they will return, and the world will finally understand what I have known all along. I can feel them, even now, their presence growing stronger with each passing day. The dreams have returned, more vivid than ever, filled with images of their world, their technology, their plans. And I know that when they come, I will be ready, for I have been chosen. And when they return, I will be waiting.